happened, though, is that Solomon began to disobey God. Solomon began to disobey God. And God was a little upset with that. So Solomon married like 700 women, and then he had 300 extra women that he just slept with because they're called concubines, and back in that culture, you're allowed to do that kind of thing, I guess. And so God wasn't happy with that. But the real problem with all that is that every one of these other women brought their own foreign religion. And as they brought their foreign religion, Solomon began to adopt it as his own, and he began to worship these other gods. And God had said to the kings a long time ago, if you follow me, I will keep you on the throne, and if you worship other gods, I will take you down. And Solomon had worshiped these other gods. And so God said, I'm done with Solomon. And now we find in verse 29, 1 Kings 11. About the time Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws, as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose and who observed my commands and statutes. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son, so that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. Pay attention. Twice now he said Jerusalem is the city where he put his name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. God says to Jeroboam, he says, listen, Solomon has forsaken me, and so I'm going to take the majority of this kingdom away, and I'm going to leave David and his descendants the land of Judah, and David and his descendants are going to be stewards over Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the city where God has put his name in the form of the temple that and the ark in the temple. That is where God has chosen to have his name. But here's the deal. He says, I am going to keep my name in Jerusalem, but I'm going to give you all the other land of Israel. And you, Jeroboam, are going to be the leader, the king. And on top of that, I'm going to build for you a dynasty that's as long-lasting as David's. And see, God had promised to David that he would be a forever king, that someone from his line would always be on the throne in Jerusalem. And in fact, we know that Jesus, the descendant of David, is the forever king that God had promised. And God said to Jeroboam, I will make you a dynasty as long-lasting as David's dynasty. Basically, God is saying to Jeroboam, you are up here with David, and Solomon is down here. I'm taking the kingdom away from Solomon, but I'm going to lift you up, Jeroboam, and you're going to be as awesome as David was. That's pretty cool. If I were Jeroboam, I'd have some pretty high expectations, right? I'd be like, wow, this is going to be amazing. I get to be king over everything I lay my eyes on, and God is going to make sure my name goes down throughout history as one of the greatest kings Israel's ever had. That'd be awesome. And then what is God's expectation? God says to Jeroboam, there's just one thing you've got to do. You have to obey me like David did. If you obey me like David did for all of his life, except for the incident with Bathsheba, and by the way, he repented at the end of that and came back. So if you obey me like David did, I will treat you like I treated David. That's what God says. If you obey like David, I will treat you like David, and you're going to be a king just as good as David. Now, I think that's pretty cool, but let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the story. Jeroboam becomes king in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 20. I'm not going to read that whole section for you. I'm just going to narrate the story. So if you're taking notes, you can do that, or if you just want to read as I talk, you can do that too. But what happens is Jeroboam goes into exile to Egypt while Solomon is still alive, because Solomon finds out that Jeroboam is going to be the next king, and Solomon decides he doesn't like God's plan, and so he wants to kill Jeroboam. Rather than saying to God, I'm sorry, he says, I'm going to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam runs off to Egypt. So now, eventually Solomon dies, and Jeroboam comes back to the land of Israel to talk to Rehoboam, Solomon's son. And he and a group of people from Israel come up to Rehoboam and they say, listen, your dad built this temple. He was rich, he was wise, but he did it all on our backs. We're the ones who built the temple. He just told us how to do it, but we're the ones who built it. He taxed us heavily. He made us work hard. And now that there's peace in the land, we think you, Rehoboam, should give us peace too. And Rehoboam said, okay, let me think about this. And he goes and he talks to the elders of Judah. He says, what should I do? And they say, be nice to these people. Give them some rest, and they will follow you the rest of their lives. But then Rehoboam went to his buddies, his homeboys. And he said, hey, tell me what I should do. And those guys said, no, you need to be tougher than your dad. Because if you want to be richer than your dad, or wealthy or better than your dad, if you want to be smarter than your dad, you need to be tougher than your dad. So go back and tell them that you can be more man than your dad ever was. And so he does. He goes back, he says, forget you. I can be more man than my dad ever was. And so I'm just going to put even higher burdens on you. I'm going to raise your taxes even more. And the people are like, all right, you do that. You watch over Jerusalem, raise your taxes all you want. But we up here in the north, Israel, we're following Jeroboam. And eventually they say, we're making him king. I printed the verse here, 1 Kings 12:20. It says this, when all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. So Jeroboam split the nation of Israel. Now there's Judah in the south, and the tribe of Benjamin is the one tribe God said, I'm going to let you keep. Judah was the tribe of David, so that was de facto already in. But then Benjamin was the one extra tribe that God said, I'm going to let you keep. And then the other 10 tribes in northern Israel are the ones that Jeroboam was going to rule over. So now let's pick it up in verse 25 of chapter 12. 12:25, and we're going to read a few verses here. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. He wanted that to be his capital. From there he went up and built up Peniel, another city. Jeroboam thought to himself, this is where we really get it, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to Rehoboam. Now, I didn't hear God say anything like that to Jeroboam, but I guess he's newly king. He's inclined to his paranoia, right? He's justified in being paranoid. I don't know. He says, after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. What? One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. Bethel is at the far southern end of Israel. So it goes like this. It goes, here's the land of Judah, here's the dividing line, here's Bethel, and then here's the land of Israel up here, and then Dan is in the north up there. So he took one of these golden calves and put it right down here on the border between Israel and Judah, took another one and put it up here in Dan, so it's at the far north of everything. And then keep going, he says, and this became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan, all the way up to Dan. That's like saying the people went all the way to Alaska to worship the one there. It's like, why would you ever go up there when you could go to Jerusalem, this great town? Well, he did this thing. Now, this is amazing because God said to Jeroboam, if you follow me, you will always be king. You or one of your descendants will always be king. Jeroboam says, if I let people worship God, they will leave me. Do you see what's going on there? Now, we're going to come back to this in just a little bit, but for right now, I want to simply say this. God gave Jeroboam a job. His job was this: the people are worshiping other gods. I want you to be my king and set it right. And he builds other gods. The exact reason he was put in that position as king is the first thing he fails at. He is a failure. Now look at this confrontation that comes. There's a bunch of verses here. We're just going to flip through a few of them. Here we go in chapter 13, verses 1 through 6. By the word of the Lord, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel, as Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make an offering. He cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord. O altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who now make offerings here. And human bones will be burned on you. So this false altar is going to be destroyed, and the priests are going to be killed on it. The false priests are going to be killed on it. That same day, the man of God gave a sign. This is the sign the Lord has declared. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out. And then just to narrate the rest, Jeroboam gets upset at this guy, and so he tells his commanders, seize him. And when he reaches out his hand, guess what? His hand shrivels. You know, like the Wizard of Oz movie, when the house is on the lady, and they take the ruby slippers, and her feet kind of go, and they just... Come, that was a cool sound. Okay, so that's what happens to his hand. It just like shrivels up, and he's like, my hand, what happened to my hand? So then he says to the man of God, he says, pray for me. Pray to your God for me that my hand would be restored. And the guy says, okay, I'll pray. So he prays, and then Jeroboam's hand is restored, and he's like, hey, I got a hand back. But by that time, the guy's already run off, so he can't go seize him again. So here's the deal. When he's confronted, his immediate response is attack the messenger. Unlike David, unlike Peter. And that is just one more failure. His first failure is these false gods. His second failure is to not respond to confrontation. And in fact, there's one more time of confrontation. His son gets sick, and he sends his wife to talk to the prophet Ahijah, who originally gave him this task of being king. He doesn't go to the guy himself because he's embarrassed, right? He doesn't want to go himself. So he sends his wife there. And when she goes there, the prophet says, listen, this son of yours is going to die. Your next son is going to die. And the king